If an army starts sending tank units into battle without tanks, that is not a tactical adjustment. That is a battlefield confession. It means something has gone so badly wrong that one of the most important arms of modern ground warfare can no longer perform the role it was built for. And that is exactly the nightmare now unfolding inside Russia's war machine. The force that once terrified Europe with visions of endless armored columns is now increasingly forced to keep its tanks far from the front line, hide them from drones, protect them from artillery, and watch as troops ride forward on motorcycles, quad bikes, and improvised vehicles into the deadliest combat zone on Earth. This is not the image of a confident military power. This is what a mechanized army looks like when it is being stripped of its mechanized advantage in real time. For years, Russian military power depended on a simple formula: mass armor, mass fire, mass pressure. Tank formations were supposed to punch through defensive belts, support infantry, crush fortified positions, and force the enemy to retreat under overwhelming steel and explosive force. That was the logic. That was the doctrine. That was the image Moscow sold to the world. But the war in Ukraine has exposed a brutal reality that Russia can no longer hide. Tank units are becoming tank units only in name. Their tanks still exist, but increasingly they are not where they are supposed to be. They are not leading the assault. They are not storming defensive lines. They are not dominating a front. In many sectors, they are sitting far back, concealed, preserved, and protected, because the moment they move into the wrong corridor, they die. That is the heart of this crisis. Ukraine has transformed huge parts of the front into what its own officials describe as a 20-kilometer kill zone. Inside that zone, visibility is relentless, drones are everywhere, movement is hunted, and any large armored vehicle that reveals itself risks immediate detection and rapid destruction. According to reporting cited from Ukraine's frontline command structure, Russian tanks and infantry fighting vehicles often do not even make it to the line of contact anymore. The battlefield is simply too transparent and too hostile. What used to be a staging area for armored breakthroughs has become a graveyard of exposed machines. When that happens, the tank stops being a weapon of shock and becomes a liability of cost, logistics, and risk. Think about what that means in practical terms. Russia parks tanks roughly 20 kilometers, or about 12.4 miles, from the front in many cases because crossing that distance has become exceptionally dangerous. AT-90 may still be one of Russia's better tanks on paper, but the problem is not only the tank itself. The problem is geometry. If the battlefield is saturated with drones and strike systems over a 20-kilometer approach, then a tank with a gun range discussed in single-digit kilometers, roughly around 8 kilometers in this context, cannot safely impose itself on that environment. It has to survive the approach first. And surviving the approach is exactly where the entire model is collapsing. A tank that cannot reach effective fighting space is no longer shaping a battle. It is hiding from it. That is why Russia has increasingly leaned on motorcycles, quad bikes, buggies, and light vehicles in assault operations. Not because they are superior to tanks. Not because they offer more protection. Not because they reflect some revolutionary new doctrine that will define the future of war. Russia is using them because they are expendable, cheap, fast, and less catastrophic to lose. A motorcycle can weave through routes where a tank would become an obvious drone target. A quad bike can be sacrificed without the political and industrial cost of losing another armored vehicle that may take months or years to replace. But that kind of adaptation comes with a terrible price. Troops riding forward without armor are more exposed, more vulnerable, and more dependent on speed, confusion, and luck. The very fact that these vehicles are filling the space once dominated by tanks tells you how severe Russia's armored crisis has become. And this is not just a matter of tactical discomfort. The numbers behind Russia's tank losses are staggering. According to the General Staff figures reported on April 16, 2026, Russia had lost 11,866 tanks since the full-scale invasion began. Even if one treats wartime official tallies carefully, that number is astonishing in scale. But the striking part is that even the most conservative visual evidence points in the same direction. The Oryx tracking project, which only counts equipment losses that can be verified through photographs or videos, has documented more than 4,000 Russian tank losses. And that is not presented as the final number. It is presented as the absolute minimum confirmed floor. Oryx itself makes clear that actual losses are significantly higher because anything without visual confirmation is excluded from the list. So whether you rely on Ukraine's much larger running estimate or the strictest open-source visual accounting, Russia's tank arm has suffered devastation on a historic scale. Once you understand that, the rest of Russia's behavior begins to make sense. Armies do not hide tanks from the front line because they suddenly stopped believing in armor. They hide tanks because they can no longer afford to lose them at the rate they already have. This war has created a new kind of pressure on heavy equipment. Every tank lost is not just a burning wreck. It is a destroyed crew, a replacement problem, a supply chain burden, a public humiliation, and a delayed future capability. In older wars, armored losses could be hidden behind statistics and replacement cycles. In Ukraine, losses are filmed, geolocated, cataloged, and replayed. The destruction is immediate, visual, and strategically cumulative. Russia's loss rate helps explain why this problem is becoming chronic rather than temporary. Reporting on Russia's armored production situation suggests that over roughly 48 months of hard fighting, Moscow has lost around 4,000 tanks, which translates to about 1,000 tanks per year. No serious military can bleed armor at that pace forever without facing a structural crisis. Russia has tried to compensate by restoring old tanks from storage, modernizing Cold War-era systems, and mixing new production with refurbishment. That has kept numbers flowing to the front, but it has not restored quality, flexibility, or confidence. Replacing a destroyed modern tank with an older restored platform is not a one-for-one recovery. It is often a downgrade disguised as replenishment. That is where the industrial story becomes just as important as the battlefield story. Russia reportedly wants Eurovagonzavod to reach a production target of 428 T-90M and T-90M2 tanks annually by 2028. On paper, that sounds like an answer. In reality, it raises even more questions. The same analysis indicates that this target is close to double current estimated output. That means the goal itself is evidence that actual current production is far lower than the number Moscow ultimately wants. And even that future target depends on a factory already dealing with pressure on labor, inputs, electronics, optics, and precision machinery. Sanctions matter here. Supply chains matter here. Workforce strain matters here. A target on paper is not the same thing as tanks rolling out in sustainable numbers under wartime conditions. The second part of that industrial weakness is even more dangerous for Russia. The Kremlin has tried to project the impression that more than one factory can support its armored regeneration. But evidence surrounding Omsk-Tranchmash suggests that Russia's supposed second major tank production pillar may be far less robust than advertised. Instead of functioning as a true source of fresh large-scale tank production, it appears to depend heavily on restoring or cannibalizing stored T-80s rather than building significant numbers of new tanks from scratch. If that is true, then Russia's tank recovery has a bottleneck at its core. Once stored hulls and usable old components decline, the illusion of depth disappears. What remains is a shrinking reserve, an overworked industrial base, and a military force to preserve what it still has rather than use it the way doctrine intended. This is why the phrase "tank units without tanks" is so devastating. It captures the difference between formal structure and real capability. Russia may still have units with historic titles, armored identities, and tank-centered organization charts. But if those formations cannot bring armor into decisive battle because the approach lanes are lethal, the replacement pipeline is strained, and the attrition cost is intolerable, then those units are no longer delivering the combat function their name implies. They become shadow versions of themselves. They become symbols of an army that still speaks in the language of mechanized dominance while increasingly fighting under the constraints of scarcity, caution, and battlefield fear. Ukraine deserves enormous credit for creating those constraints. This did not happen by accident. It happened because Kyiv and its forces adapted faster than many expected. One of the most important examples is the Drone Line Initiative, a large-scale effort to systematize unmanned warfare along the line of contact. backed by $880 million in support. The project has helped build a persistent wall of drone reconnaissance and strike coverage that makes movement toward Ukrainian positions extraordinarily costly. More than 1,000 crews operate under that broader framework. Over the winter alone, the unmanned systems forces, including participating drone line units, neutralized around 30,000 Russian occupiers. That kind of system is not just about technology. It is about endurance, volume, surveillance density, and battlefield integration. It is about turning the front into a zone where the enemy cannot move without being seen and cannot be seen without being threatened. The results became even clearer in March. Ukraine's defense ministry reported over 35,000 Russian troops killed or seriously wounded during that month, including the often cited figure of roughly 35,300 enemy losses, making it one of the most punishing periods of attrition since the launch of the Army of Drones bonus system. Ukrainian unmanned systems alone accounted for 33,988 verified hits in March, while total targets hit exceeded 151,000. At the same time, Ukraine reported destroying 274 enemy air defense systems, 121 multiple launch rocket systems, 212 artillery pieces, and self-propelled artillery systems, and intercepting 33,686 enemy UAVs of various types. Those numbers matter because they reveal the scale of the battlefield ecosystem Russia now has to cross. The tank is not facing one threat. It is facing a network of threats. And that network is what turns Russia's heavy armor from an offensive spearhead into a museum piece on standby. Every time a tank sits hidden in a rear shelter instead of supporting an assault, that is evidence that Ukraine has forced a change in the cost-benefit calculation. Russian commanders know that a destroyed motorcycle squad is tragic but replaceable. A destroyed tank is a strategic wound. It represents industry, transport, crew training, optics, maintenance, and political embarrassment all collapsing in one explosion. So the Kremlin preserves tanks. But the more it preserves them, the less useful they become. This is the paradox. Russia is trying to save its tank force by limiting its role, but in doing so it is weakening the very battlefield effect that tanks are meant to create. Meanwhile, Ukraine has not responded to drone warfare by abandoning traditional heavy systems. It has responded by repurposing them intelligently. One of the best examples is how Ukrainian forces have used Leopard 1A5 tanks from covered positions as makeshift artillery. Rather than insisting tanks must only serve in classical direct-fire roles, Ukraine has shown flexibility. Reporting on these adaptations says Ukrainian crews have used Leopard 1A5S for indirect fire missions at around 12 kilometers and may eventually extend that to 18 kilometers with upgraded turret solutions. That is a remarkable example of doctrinal creativity. While Russia is parking tanks because it fears losing them in a drone-heavy approach, Ukraine is finding new ways to get value out of armor in a battlefield transformed by precision strikes and unmanned reconnaissance. That contrast tells you something fundamental about the war. Both sides are under pressure. Both sides are adapting, but they are adapting from different starting points. Russia is adapting downward from a model of heavy mechanized force projection that no longer functions as intended. Ukraine is adapting upward from necessity, combining older systems, Western aid, local innovation, and drone integration into a more flexible defense and strike architecture. Russia's adaptation often looks like substitution under duress. Ukraine's often looks like integration under pressure. That difference matters because one preserves combat effectiveness, while the other often merely compensates for its erosion. The deeper tragedy for Russia is that this outcome was not supposed to be possible. Moscow entered this war expecting that mass, artillery, armor, and intimidation would eventually grind Ukraine down. Instead, Ukraine learned how to weaponize visibility. It learned how to stretch cheap drones across expensive battle space. It learned how to turn roads, staging areas, and approach corridors into monitored kill funnels. It learned how to multiply the battlefield value of every operator, every strike drone, every reconnaissance feed, and every verified hit. Once that happened, the traditional Russian advantage in armored mass started losing meaning. A tank formation only terrifies the enemy if it can reach the enemy. If it dies before arrival, It becomes a supply chain problem and camouflage netting. And this is where the strategic consequences become impossible to ignore. An army that cannot confidently employ tanks at the front loses more than equipment. It loses tempo. It loses confidence in combined arms maneuver. It loses the ability to threaten deep armored pushes with the same credibility. It loses flexibility in offensive planning. It becomes more predictable, more infantry dependent, and more vulnerable to the slow bleeding logic of attritional war. Russia can still attack. It can still inflict damage. It can still pressure sectors and rotate manpower. But every time it sends forward troops on motorcycles instead of under-armored cover, it is advertising that the war has changed in ways its doctrine was not built to master. That is why this story matters so much. It is not really about whether a Russian unit technically still has tanks on its roster. It is about whether those tanks can still perform the role that once made them central to Russia's concept of war. Increasingly, the answer appears to be no. The tanks are too valuable to lose, too exposed to use freely, too difficult to replace quickly, and too constrained by a drone-dominated battlefield to dominate the way they once did. So Russia improvises. It sends lighter vehicles. It disperses manpower. It preserves armor. It sacrifices doctrine. And every one of those choices reveals the same truth. The force that once wanted to crush Ukraine under steel now has to think twice before moving steel into view. That may be one of the most damning indicators yet of how deeply this war has broken Russia's old military model. Not because tanks have become irrelevant forever. They have not. Not because motorcycles can somehow replace armored warfare. They cannot. But because Ukraine has shown that with enough drones, enough integration, enough surveillance, and enough relentless attrition, even a state built around mechanized intimidation can be pushed into fighting like an army that no longer trusts its own armor to survive the road to battle. And once a tank army stops trusting its tanks, the collapse is no longer theoretical. It is already underway.